Few battles in human history were as brutal as the US invasion of Okinawa, but what happened to the bodies of the countless soldiers and civilians who died? The Battle of Okinawa was the last major conflict of World War II, ending a mere 2 months before the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the Western Front, Germany surrendered in May 1945, right in the middle of the battle, meaning that Okinawa was essentially the conventional combat capstone to both the Pacific Theater of Operations and the war as a whole. It was also one of the most brutal battles of the war. Japanese soldiers proved more than willing to defend the island or die trying. Kamikaze rockets, torpedoes, ships, and planes bombarded US vessels, and the situation on land wasn't much better. US Marine Eugene Sledge described the battle in his book With the Old Breed, which would later become the basis for the HBO series The Pacific. He wrote, "The scene was nothing but mud. Shellfire flooded craters with their silent, pathetic, rotting occupants, knocked out tanks and Amtraks, and discarded equipment. Utter desolation."
There's not a day goes by that I don't think about it.
Nearly 250,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died over 83 days on Okinawa, and the US suffered one of the costliest battles in the country's history. In fact, the fighting was so vicious that it left President Truman rattled, as Joseph Whelan explained in his book Bloody Okinawa, The Last Great Battle of World War II. Whelan wrote, "They could see how costly it would be to invade the mainland. The island would just be a charred cinder." In this sense, the brutality of Okinawa, as well as Iwo Jima before it, directly influenced the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan. Death was everywhere on Okinawa. The battlefield was full of the residue of battle, as one 77th Infantry Division soldier once wrote, including the bodies of Japanese soldiers and civilians lying torn asunder. Ghastly as it sounds, the front lines were close enough for the living to head out every single day, retrieve what remains they could, and bring them back for burial. These remains were interred at temporary cemeteries further away from the combat areas. There were 6 such cemeteries in total across Okinawa.
And they were just snuffed out.
After Japan officially surrendered on September 2, 1945, the United States Department of War set about retrieving the men who'd been buried at these temporary cemeteries. In total, authorities recovered 10,243 such individuals and sent their remains to Saipan, north of Guam in the Pacific Ocean. At that point, next of kin determined whether they wanted the remains sent back to the US or kept at a military cemetery overseas. Official death tolls for US troops from Okinawa reached about 12,500, 7,500 ground units, and 5,000 soldiers. Given the number of bodies recovered, this means that over 2,000 Americans never made it to the US's temporary cemeteries. The Battle of Okinawa might have been the final major battle of World War II, but it was the first and last battle of the war fought within Japan's national borders. Okinawa itself had been absorbed into Japan in 1875. Prior to that, Okinawans were their own people who had lived in their own kingdom for over 400 years. When the US attacked Okinawa in 1945, all of its history ended up in the crossfire, as well as hundreds of thousands of civilians. Many more Okinawan civilians died during the Battle of Okinawa than Japanese soldiers, up to 150,000 civilians versus more than 70,000 soldiers. As the battle raged on, locals could do nothing but flee south through active battlefields until there was nowhere left to run. PBS quotes one survivor as saying, "We saw dead bodies, crying and screaming people, and a person who was begging to be shot to death. It was total chaos." It fell to those same locals to gather the dead after the war ended. They built monuments around Okinawa as they burned the fallen until the Japanese government finally intervened in 1955. Uncollected remains were gathered together in Naha, Okinawa's capital, but the ossuary there proved too small. The bones were then moved to Itoman, south of Naha, where they were collectively cremated and interred as part of a memorial complex. Not all of those who died during the Battle of Okinawa were moved to temporary cemeteries on the US side or collected and burned on the Japanese side. Numerous sources provided glimpses into the worst possible outcome for many of the deceased on both sides: desecration. Teeth, skulls, and ears were the US military's most commonly collected form of so-called war trophies, and often carried around by combatants and in some cases sent back home. Life magazine's May 22, 1944 picture of the week famously featured a young US woman gazing at a Japanese skull on her desk sent to her by her Navy boyfriend. A staggering testament to how normalized abuse of human remains became during the Pacific War.
For 70 years, they didn't hear anything, and then they get a phone call to say their relative had been found. It was like their father was coming home.
The remains of those who fell on Okinawa continue to be found to this day, largely thanks to active search efforts. In 2021, for example, 8 individuals were found in a cave in Okinawa South. An Okinawan official told the Asahi Shimbun, In the past 7 to 8 years, the remains of 1 to 3 people are typically found at a single location. Finding more than 5 remains is unusual. More recently, in 2023, the remains of 46 women and 1 child were discovered together. The nonprofit Kuentai USA, a joint Japanese-American venture, remains devoted to uncovering and repatriating those still unaccounted for on Okinawa and other Pacific islands. Formed in 2014, they found 16,000 soldiers in the Philippines and 800 in Saipan to date. They have since turned their attention to Okinawa. The organization even holds a list of named, still missing U.S. servicemen. The clock is ticking too. In 2021, the Japanese Ministry of Defense announced a plan to build a new U.S. military base on Okinawa. Public protests aimed at the development pointed out that construction is likely to damage the remains of those killed during the war. Even the remains left elsewhere are now almost 80 years old and rapidly decomposing. As Kuentai USA says, if the remains are not repatriated sooner, there would be nothing to identify when the remains are all disappeared.